And action. I got the hand, so we're ready to go. Good. How is everybody doing? Good. Am I a little loud, or is that a good volume? Maybe can you turn me down just a wee bit? That'd be great. Thanks. So this is week 5. Is it still loud, or is that good? Loud? I'm sorry for shouting. So we have this week and next week, and then that's it. So hopefully you guys have learned something, enjoyed something. For me, it's been great to be able to prepare for this and, spend a little bit of time kind of revisiting classes that I've taught in the past before. And so thank you guys for coming. I know it's a commitment to come every night, and it kind of gets tiring too. And last week, I know I really dumped a lot of info on you. So hopefully this week won't be as heavy. Before we start, let me just pray for us though. And our class is getting smaller, so it's easier to interact. But does anybody have any prayer requests that I could pray for? I actually have a request. I got word this week that a really good friend of mine, one of my best friends in Israel, is extremely ill in Israel, fighting for his life with COVID. Doesn't look good. So if you can think of him, that'd be great. His name's John. I figured I'll pray for him tonight. But does anybody else have a request that we can bring before the Lord? My parents? Yeah, that's true. My parents are coming back this week, I think. You probably know better than I do. Yeah. Is it Sunday? Yes, it is Sunday. Good. Let me pray, and then we can start. Father God, thank you for another week that has gone by, and we are grateful for every day that you give us. And we are so used to taking health for granted, for taking food, shelter, just the many things that we enjoy, almost as a right. But your word says that it's a gift from you. Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father above, the Father of lights, with whom there's no shifting shadow or change. And Lord, that's you, and we just are thankful that we can rely on a God that doesn't change. And I pray for everyone here. I know everyone probably has a prayer request and is busy or tired or whatever it may be. I pray that you would just comfort them in their journey, in their life that you've given them. I pray that you would help us, every one of us, in our daily interactions with one another to remember that we are ambassadors for you. Help us to have a deep and strong faith in you, because only in you is there joy, and only in you is there hope and joy of what is to come, because we know that we trust in a Father who loves us. Lord, I pray for my friend John right now. I pray that you would heal his body and that you would touch him. I pray that you would bring him out of the hospital bed. And your word says for us to bring our requests and make them known to you. So I just pray for him, as I have been for a couple days now, and just pray for anyone else here that also knows people that are sick or ill or experiencing difficulties. Pray for them, that you would touch them. Lord, your word says nothing takes you by surprise, and we believe that. I just pray that you give us the grace to accept your will for our life, whatever it may be. And I pray now also for this evening, help us to be able to focus and enjoy the material that you have for us to look at, and may it be useful for us as we seek to know your word more. And I pray in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so as you can see on the slide there, tonight I want to try and get us down into the first centuries, BC and AD, and then next week is the last week. And the idea there is we'll look at Jesus and the first century and kind of some things specifically connected to the life of Jesus, maybe some chronology and some other things related specifically to Jesus in the 1st century AD, and that's the end. Then we've bridged the gap actually between the Old and the New Testament. So before that, I figured get with your partner for just a second. We'll take 3 minutes here. Maybe just discuss with somebody one interesting thing that you've learned so far. Maybe one thing you've heard that's kind of piqued your interest in a particular topic or something, a historical issue, something you'd maybe like to learn a little bit more about, and then maybe one thing that is unclear or fuzzy that you're like, yeah, Ben said something about, I don't even understand what. Something like that. So take a minute or two, talk about that, and then we'll get back into it. All right. Anybody want to share something for number one? What's one interesting thing? Yeah?
I never realized was because the history is extremely rich during those 400 years, if you look historical events.
Mm-hmm.
I never realized that the matter of the Bible is completely empty.
Right. Yeah. That's why they call it the 400 years of silence. You get to the end of the Bible and you're like, what happened? Anything else that you found interesting?
I'd like to know more about Elephantine.
Okay. A little bit more about Elephantine Island. Yeah.
You were saying something about Hanukkah, how there was no mention of that, the actual Hanukkah, as the tradition of the oil not running out for 8 days.
Right.
Up until what century?
Really until the Talmud, so like the 5th century AD.
Okay. But what we do have in scriptures is mention of it being Feast of Lights.
Yeah, so in John 10, it's the Feast of Dedication. And then not in the scripture, but in Josephus and in Maccabees. So Maccabees is not scripture, but it talks about, Josephus says that it's the feast that they call of light because the deliverance came about like a lamp in the night, right? So like turn on the light, and you had this dark period in history, and all of a sudden, within a matter of weeks, months, all of a sudden the Maccabees are like pushing off the Greek yoke, and they're like an independent kingdom. It came so quickly.
Because they weren't able to practice Judaism, you said?
For 3 years, yeah. Yep. Anything else? Yeah, in the back.
A little unclear on the Hasmoneans. I was kind of under the impression that they were descendants of David.
Nope, they're from the tribe of Levi. And in Maccabees, it says that they're from a priestly family, from the tribe of Levi, originally from Jerusalem, but yeah, they're not from the line of Judah. Good question. Yeah.
I didn't know there was such a large controversy about the Exodus dates, so that's something I'm going to look into more in my own studies.
Yes, you're right, and I didn't even talk about it, did I? So like, I'm gonna leave that one to the side.
See, that tells me how controversial it is.
Yeah, it's a matter of 200 years, right? So like I said, if you go for the late day, you just get to heaven 200 years later. It's fine. Yes. Yeah.
When you're in the Old Testament, you hear about Babylonia and all the people who were in control. Then all of a sudden it gets silence, and you have Rome and Jesus, the Jews. And I like the idea of finding out Alexander came through and united everything together. And it's like, oh, that's what happened during that silent time.
Right? Yeah. And there's Persia as well, even before Alexander, but yeah, totally. Anything else unclear? Everything's clear as mud? Yeah?
Well, I don't know if you mentioned it. We talk about 1 BC and 1 AD, and the Jewish calendar is different. We are talking about the Old Testament, which is the Jewish first part of the Bible.
Right.
Now, when did we decide to become of 1 BC? I mean, if everything is calculated and the history starts at the Old Testament, and how we came up with 1 BC.
Yeah, so it happened, the Gregorian calendar is the BC and the AD that we have now. And that came about in the 800s AD. There was a monk called, I don't remember his name. I have it in my mind somewhere. At some point I'll remember his name, but he's the one that decided to reckon time according to the birth of Jesus. And as I'll probably say later today, if not tomorrow or next week, he was off by a couple years, because I don't think Jesus was born in 0, but pretty close, right? So he's probably off by about 5 years. But that calendar is like about 800 AD. That's the calendar that we use today. The Jewish calendar, so the Jews today that are like Orthodox Jews, they have a different calendar. So in their calendar, this is the year, like, I always forget, but it's like 58 or 57. Last I remember was 5764, but that was like probably 15 years ago. So they reckon time according to the 6th day of creation, so the day that Adam was created. So in their view, there's been 5,700 and whatever their number is, years since Adam was created.
So pretty much what you're saying, it's only 800 years later, AD, that we could
Correct. Yep.
remember. So my question now, considering the Bible, all the scripture were before 8 AD, will that say that the Bible is being rewritten in 800 AD?
I say that one more time because you lost me.
Well, I lost myself, so.
Okay, so I don't feel so bad.
You're talking about this Gregorian, this calendar we are using for
Yeah.
the Bible is being based 800 AD. Is that correct?
Yes.
Meaning that we start to have those numbers, those dates, only 800 years pretty much after the Bible happens.
Correct.
So that means the Bible was rewritten.
No, I mean, basically, I think you're thinking of it maybe not in the right way. What they did is they just came up with a system that explained the number of years that elapsed between the time of Jesus and 800 AD. So it's not like, oh, now we have to like somehow like take 800 years out of the Bible or something like that. They just were like, okay, this is the year that we're at now. We'll call it year A. And then we know Jesus was born in year X. So how do we reckon that amount of time? And so through a very complicated process that I don't fully understand, to be honest, they got back to the time of Jesus, and those numbers came about in about 800 AD. Chronology is really, I like to dabble in it a little bit, and maybe next week we'll talk about like the chronology of Jesus' life and that kind of thing, because I think it's really fascinating. But it's also really complicated, and especially if you go into the Old Testament chronology. But you have to basically match what you understand from different geographical regions. So you have like a chronology in Egypt, a chronology in Assyria, a chronology in Babylon, and you have, let's say the Babylonians, they kept really detailed lists of their kings. So you have a different king that was ruling every year. So they kept that list. So theoretically, if you worked through the list, you could, reckon 50 years of time, or whatever, 150 years of time, but then you have to match that with what we know about the rest of the world and kind of see where they intersect. So it's a very fascinating topic, but it can also get very complicated very quickly. And we're not trying to do that. We're trying to keep it clear. So with that, let me just move on and pick up where we left off last time, and that was basically with this, right? You guys remember this slide? So we talked about the Samaritans and how in approximately just before Nehemiah's time, a group went up into northern Israel and built a temple, actually more central Israel. So that's the area of Shechem today, if you know where that is. That's what this picture is here, by the way. That's the city of Shechem. And you have the two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, with the ancient city of Shechem mentioned in the Old Testament, Joshua 24, Joshua 10, I think it is, where they renewed the covenant there. In any case, they built a temple on top of that mountain there, 500, and it stood until the temple was destroyed in 110 BC. And I didn't get to that because that's what we're going to talk about today, but in the reign of a Maccabean king or a Hasmonean king. Remember, those are interchangeable terms. A guy called John Hyrcanus. So there actually was a temple that was standing at the same time as the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, so it stood for about 400 years, not quite 400 years, up there on Mount Gerizim. And the Samaritans, however, continued to live in the central hill country of Israel into the New Testament period and beyond. And like I said last week, even today, there are about 800 Samaritans that live in Israel and in the West Bank of today. And this is a picture of the high priest. They have their Passover every year that they celebrate. They actually slaughter a lamb. And you remember the Samaritans differ from the Jews in that the Samaritans believe that the central place of worship is Mount Gerizim or Shechem, okay, that city that I showed you earlier between those two hills. And remember that comes up in John chapter 4 when Jesus speaks to the woman at the well, and the woman says, "Our fathers say you should worship on this mountain. You Jews say you should worship in the temple in Jerusalem." And then she kind of continues on and she says, "Well, when the Messiah comes, we'll figure everything out." And then Jesus says, "I who speak to you am he." Jesus says he is the Messiah. And then he says that famous passage that we know that there's going to come a day when we will worship not in this mountain, not in the mountain in Jerusalem, but everybody will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And therefore sort of de-geographicalizing, I just made up that word. Is that a word? So there's no longer a geographical location associated to worship, as there was in the Old Testament period and into the New Testament period. I mean, you could worship God everywhere, obviously, but there was a temple in Jerusalem, and that was the central place of worship. The Samaritans disagreed with that, okay? And so that whole sort of theology arose first started in the 6th century BC, so 500 BC, and then it went. The temple was destroyed there in, as I said, about 110 BC. So that's where we left off last week, and now we continue on. And I'm going to go quickly here, and kind of a little heads up. I got a lot of pictures to show you tonight too, so that'll be kind of nice. Pictures 1,000 words, so maybe I can close my mouth and just show some pictures. But when we talk about Herod the Great, I want to kind of show you some pictures of what Herod built, because he's an amazing builder in Jesus' day. So this is where we're headed to. We're going from John Hyrcanus down to Herod the Great, okay? And you guys know Herod the Great from the New Testament. And so just to show you that slide there once again, remember Mattathias is the first Hasmonean or Maccabee, and his 5 sons lead the rebellion after he dies. Judas, remember, and then Jonathan, and then Simon. And then now we get to John Hyrcanus. Okay, now I'm going to just real briefly touch on a couple of these guys just to bring us down to Jesus' time. Okay, and here's kind of a snapshot of those guys. John Hyrcanus is the first Hasmonean king that is actually just born into this political situation. Okay, he wasn't part of the rebellion, right? And so he's just born into, he's a sort of a second generation Hasmonean king. And he actually rules longer than any of the other kings here. Any of these other Hasmonean kings, he rules for 31 years. And just a couple things about his reign. One, the longest rule, but also during his time, the Hasmonean kingdom began to expand. And you remember I mentioned in the very first class that the largest territory that Israel ruled over was during which time? In all of Israel's history. Solomon's time, good, yeah. So his kingdom extended all the way up into the reaches of the Euphrates River, all the way almost down to Egypt. From then on, though, the kingdom of Israel, the territory of the nation of Israel was significantly shrunk, and it was modified. But during John Hyrcanus' rule, it begins to grow again. And as we'll see later on, under Alexander Ginnaeus, his son, once again, the kingdom of the Maccabees is comparable to the reign of David, let's say. So pretty close. So this kind of gives you an idea of how independent and how influential the Hasmoneans were in relation to the other powers of the world. Because remember, only when the cat's away can the mice play, right? And so if the cat is doing their own thing, if Greece is, busy with their own political turmoil, that gives room for the Jews to expand their kingdom. And that was one of the characteristics of John Hyrcanus's rule. Okay, so you see some expansions during his reign. Another very interesting thing that happens during his rule is he does something that was formerly unprecedented, kind of redundant, isn't it? Was unprecedented throughout all of Israel's history. And that is, he forces a people group that is not Jewish to become Jewish. Okay, so you can see that I have here, I kind of put these circles up here just so you can get an idea of which areas were sort of absorbed into John Hyrcanus's territory. These were already primarily Jewish, Judea and Galilee, but then Samaria eventually comes under the rule of this Hasmonean king, the area of the Moabites of the Old Testament, Medeba. This is the area, kind of the Philistines. But these guys down here, these Idumeans, and these guys are important because they're connected to Herod the Great, or Herod the Great's connected to them. These people are not Jewish. They are actually descendants of the former territory of Edom of the Old Testament. You've heard of them before? Edom, right? The Edomites. And what happened is when the Israelites were exiled in 586, temples destroyed, Nebuchadnezzar also sacked or plundered these nations over here. You have Ammon, Moab, Edom down here, the Arameans up there. So the Edomites were down here. They also were attacked and sort of plundered. Some of them were carried off into exile. But as time went on, they eventually migrated and settled down here in the southern part of the country. So they're Edomites, not Israelites, okay? They don't have any Jewish blood flowing through their veins. And what John Hyrcanus does, though, is he becomes a powerful king. Remember, his territory is expanding. And so he says, hey, if you guys want to stay in our kingdom, you got to start living like us. So he forces them to convert to Judaism, forces them to circumcise their men, forces them to celebrate the Passover, the Shabbat, the Sabbath days, and the festivals. And so the Edomites, they're faced with two options. They say, well, either we die or we can become Jews. We'll take the Jewish option. And so they actually become Jewish. And these Edomites, or as they're known as Idumean, you can hear the same name. It's a sort of Greek form of Edomites. They actually become Jewish. Okay, and so Herod the Great is actually a descendant of these people, of these Idumeans. And that happens during the rule of John Hyrcanus in about 120 BC, approximately. War is characteristic of his reign. Well, not quite as much as this next guy that we'll talk about, but because he was expanding the kingdom, he engaged in a lot of warfare. Josephus says he even opened up the tomb of King David. So they knew where David's tomb was from almost 1,000 years earlier, 900 years earlier. Okay, 1 Kings chapter 2 says that David was buried in Jerusalem. So Josephus says that this guy, John Hyrcanus, opened up David's tomb, stole some of the gold that was put in there, like I think he says 3 talents of actually silver, and used that to hire foreign troops to help him sort of expand his kingdom. Okay, so that's John Hyrcanus. Rules for longer than any other person. And now an interesting note that Josephus says here, he says that Hyrcanus united in his person 3 of the highest privileges: the supreme command of the nation, so that's the king, the high priesthood, that's the priest, and the gift of prophecy. For so closely in touch was he with the deity that he was never ignorant of the future. Well, I just thought that's an interesting note, that Josephus says that this is the first guy that actually united these three offices, the office of king, priest, and prophet. And, obviously, Jesus is the one that perfectly unites those. He's our king, he's our high priest, and he's often sort of seen as this prophetic figure because he's calling people back to repentance, which is what the prophets frequently did in the Old Testament period. And yet, sort of that idea was sort of started, you might say, with John Hyrcanus, who was like, I think I would like to be king, priest, and prophet as well. Okay, so that's John Hyrcanus. Aristobulus, his son, there he is right there, comes over or comes onto the scene after he dies. Nothing real spectacular about his reign. He also actually continued to force people to proselytize. But I'm just going to kind of skip over him and then get to his successor, a guy called Alexander Ginnaeus. Okay, Alexander Ginnaeus. Now, he was severely disliked. Okay, so he became a very important king because he expanded the territory of the Jews in that time to unprecedented heights. Okay, so he actually had a really large kingdom. There's kind of a map. I don't know if you can see that shading there. Okay, so there is the shading area of Alexander Ginnaeus' territory. And if you remember, I don't know if you can remember, but that slide that I showed you that first night, this is about comparable to the territory of David. Okay, so he's kind of like a David-like figure, you might say. The Jews are independent. They're being ruled by their own people. But this guy is severely disliked. Let me go the other way. And so the Jews revolt. And what happens is they don't like the idea. Not everybody is so keen about the idea of the king also being the high priest. So first of all, the Hasmoneans, and that was a good question earlier. I don't remember your name, sorry, but Adam. That not everybody's so keen about these guys that are from the tribe of Levi ruling as kings. Because which tribe is the ruling tribe? It's supposed to be Judah, right? Genesis 49 says the scepter shall not depart from Judah. And yet you got these Levites that are saying they're the king of Israel. They're not from the ruling tribe of Judah. And yet they also are saying that they're high priests and they're not from the house of Aaron. So not everybody's loving these Hasmoneans. And so there's definitely some rifts among the population. So the Jews eventually revolt. 6,000 of them are more than 6,000, but a number of the population revolts against his taking the high priesthood. And so Alexander Ginnaeus responds by killing 6,000 of his own people who were against him being high priest. And then that results in a 6-year civil war, actually, between these different factions of Jews in the nation. And Alexander Ginnaeus ends up slaughtering 50,000 more. So that's a large number of people that he's killing of his own countrymen. And so what happens is the people that are sort of the opposition to Alexander Ginnaeus decide that they need to get some more forces, and so some of them actually side with the Greeks. So they become more Hellenistic, and they turn to Antioch, right, where the Seleucids are ruling, and they try and get some forces to try and push out Alexander Ginnaeus so that they can put their own guy in there. And how does he respond? He responds by crucifying 800 Jews while he's feasting with his concubines. So not really the kind of a guy that is like a good role model to imitate. And remember, I showed you that picture earlier. This is not a historical picture, but it kind of gives the idea of, remember, that's what Alexander the Great had done to the people in Tyre 150 years earlier. And that's the only record that we have of a Jewish ruler executing Jewish people by crucifixion. Pretty significant time in Israel's history. And you can see how power really can corrupt the individual. I just finished reading Animal Farm. Anybody ever read that? I thought it was an interesting book. Same kind of an idea here, right? It's like you're happy. You don't want these overlords kind of telling you what to do, and the next thing you know, you're doing the same thing. Now, what's interesting is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a commentary on the book of Nahum. Okay, so let me just do a little parentheses here for a second. The Dead Sea Scrolls written, you remember what years? 250 BC to about 66 AD, approximately. Okay, so about 250 years before Christ. So that means right now we're in about 100 BC. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are being written by the Qumran community. The Jews are part of a sect called the Essenes, which I'll talk about later. And what they did is they not only copied the Bible, but they also wrote all kinds of other manuscripts. They wrote books that we didn't know previously existed. They wrote commentaries on the Bible. They wrote a sort of manuals for how to become part of the Essene community. Well, one Dead Sea Scroll that was found is this commentary on the book of Nahum. And they give an interesting interpretation of this passage here. So here's what the Old Testament text says. If you just look at Nahum 2, verse 12, it says, "The lion tore enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his lionesses. He filled his caves with prey and his dens with torn flesh." Now, I'll let you check the commentaries to see what is actually being talked about. Maybe he's talking about Assyria, something that's going on over there. The way that the Qumran community understood this passage, though, they understood it to refer to a specific individual, namely, any guesses? Alexander Ginnaeus. So this is written here. They say this. Here is how this passage is interpreted. This concerns the furious young lion who executes revenge on those who seek smooth things, Pharisees, and hangs men alive, formerly in Israel. Because of a man hanged alive on the tree, he proclaims, "Behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts." And so it's an interpretation of Nahum, and because of their sort of what Alexander Ginnaeus had been doing at that time, they sort of understood that passage to be a prophecy of this guy here. And they're saying he's the lion that is tearing this flesh of his prey. So kind of interesting commentary by the Qumran community as to how they viewed this guy, Alexander Ginnaeus. They didn't like him. So when he dies, he ends up transferring power to his wife. And this is actually important because it's going to lead to a feud after his wife dies as to who actually is the actual next ruler. So his wife is a woman called Alexandra Salome. And nothing too spectacular about her reign. She rules for, how many years is that? 8 years or so? 7 years. And what she does, though, is she appoints her son Hercules, Hercules the second here, as the high priest. And I put in parentheses, note she's a woman. According to the Old Testament, a woman can't be a high priest, but doesn't mean she can't necessarily be a queen. So she is the queen of Israel. She becomes the ruler of Israel, appoints her son Hercules II as the high priest, and overall is successful in keeping the peace among the Israelite nation, among the Jews living at that time. When she dies, though, some trouble breaks out, and that is when there's this sort of feud between her son Hercules II and Aristobulus II. There's some infighting among these two brothers. Which one is actually going to be the ruler? Now you can see, because there's not a clear succession that has been set up from the very beginning. Right? Remember, going back up to the top, Mattathias was the initiator of the revolt, He's from the tribe of Levi. There's not like a clear pattern of succession. He dies and Judas takes over, and then Jonathan takes over, and then Simon takes over. So you can see already there's been been about 100 years or so of sort of this fuzziness as to who's going to be the legitimate ruler in Israel. And it's really, it works out to be whoever is the strong man in power. And that's how it's going to continue to be all the way up to the time of Herod the Great. So these two brothers fight about who is going to be the ruler of the nation. Hyrcanus is actually the firstborn, so he's the oldest one, and so he claims to be the legitimate successor. But there's one problem. He's actually a weak individual, not very charismatic, doesn't really know how to be a good politician. He'd probably rather just hang out and enjoy life. But because he's the oldest of ruling parents, Alexander Ginnaeus and Alexandra Salome, he by default is given the kingdom. And I'll talk about this here in just a second, but he's supported by a guy called Antipater and another guy called Herod. He happens to be pro-Pharisee, which again I'll talk about later. His brother, though, is younger and stronger. He supports the other faction, and those are the Sadducees. Okay, so there's this infighting that arises among the Jewish nation, and the two brothers come to a truce, and they say, here's the arrangement that we'll make. Aristobulus, probably being the better politician, says, I'll be the high priest and the king. You'll step out of public affairs, and you'll get to just enjoy our parents' wealth, right? So you have no political influence, but you can just kind of live the good life, and he actually agrees to that. So Aristobulus sort of tricks his brother into just kind of stepping out of the spotlight, and Aristobulus becomes the king. And everything probably would have been fine had there not been another player that steps into this political chess game, and that's this guy, Antipater. Okay, Antipater, he senses an opportunity. He recognizes that this guy, Hyrcanus, is the legitimate ruler because he's the oldest, right? He's the firstborn, so according to the way kings become kings, it's the firstborn who is the successor to the king when he dies. And he realizes that this guy's kind of a weak politician. So it's a perfect opportunity for him, a go-getter, strong military guy, to possibly have some really powerful political influence. And so he convinces Hyrcanus to fight against Aristobulus and take back the kingdom from his brother. Now, he's got political ambitions as well, right? This is Antipater, and Antipater is the father of Herod the Great. Okay, so that now you can see how Herod the Great slowly steps onto the political scene, and I like that. Welcome to the world of politics, right? If you see a weakness, you jump on it and you try and assert your political influence as much as possible. So really, that's how kind of Herod the Great slips into the political scene, I guess you could say. And Antipater backs Hyrcanus, and the two still are kind of fight for power. Okay, so Hyrcanus supported by Antipater and Aristobulus. And it really results in kind of a stalemate. Backed by this stronger figure, he's got a little bit more influence. Aristobulus has some people on his side, so there's a stalemate that ensues. And how is that stalemate broken? We got to bring the cats over, right? Remember, these are just the mice that are playing. So who's the big cat in the region at this time? Greece is actually waning in influence. Rome. Yeah, so Rome comes onto the scene. And the way that Rome comes into the nation of Israel is by a general called Pompey. I know a lot of people call him Pompey. I did for years too, but I think you're supposed to say Pompey. In any case, he is a very prominent Roman general. Okay, so he's sent over from Rome. Rome is trying to expand their borders in order to make the Mediterranean a Roman lake. Right? They want to capture the territory all around the Mediterranean Sea. So right at this time, the biggest general in Rome, Pompey, is in the region. And he hears about this infighting in this small nation of Judea. So he comes to the region and he finds that there's a stalemate between these two rivals who both are claiming to be the heirs to the throne. So who is Pompey going to support? Well, he comes to the city and he realizes that the city is actually, half of the city welcomes him. And so, actually probably more than half, most of the city are on, most of the inhabitants are on Hyrcanus's side. And so they say, let's let Rome in. If we support Rome, they'll strengthen our position. They'll put our guy in power. We'll also have peace with the big cat. What could be better? Aristobulus, the fighter, says, no way, we're going to fight against them. And so half of the city welcomes Rome into Jerusalem. And Aristobulus ends up fleeing to the central part of the city right there. That's the Temple Mount. Okay, so there's actually a temple there at that time, right? Remember, that's the second temple. This is the Dome of the Rock from the modern picture. But all of the city of Jerusalem, basically this whole area right here, all of that is welcomes Rome. Pompey comes in, and now he's fighting against this guy, Aristobulus. And Josephus talks about this. He gives lots of details. But what happens is there's about a 3-month siege. And then Rome eventually punches through the walls of the Temple Mount and takes Aristobulus off to Rome and puts Hyrcanus in power. Okay, so Hyrcanus becomes the king. And because Antipater had been sort of backing him the whole time, Antipater also becomes a prominent figure in this sort of kingdom that is sort of really ruled by a distance by Rome. Okay, is all that making sense so far? So let me mention this real quick. When Pompey goes into the temple area in order to take Aristobulus out, he can't hold himself back. He's got to check to see what's inside the Holy of Holies, right? I mean, how can you not peek inside the temple? So he goes in there, and what he finds there is nothing. There's actually nothing in the Holy of Holies. And this is what the Roman historian Tacitus says. He says, when Pompeius was the first of our countrymen to subdue the Jews, availing himself of the right of conquest, he entered the temple. And thus it became commonly known that the place stood empty with no similitude of gods within, and that the shrine had nothing to reveal. So it's an interesting little historical note. Josephus says the same thing as well on the Jewish side. When Pompey goes into the Holy of Holies, he doesn't find what should be there. What should be there? The ark, right? No ark. So kind of going back to the previous discussion, what happened to the ark? Well, it never came back, and evidently was never rebuilt either. So throughout the entire Second Temple period, there's no ark in the Holy of Holies. So what did the high priest sprinkle blood on, on the Day of Atonement? Probably the floor, but there was no ark there. So an interesting historical note. So that's true on into Jesus' day. There was no shrine, no Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. And so Pompey sees that, he's like, what's the big deal? All this fuss about nothing. There's not even anything in their temple. So he comes, and as I said, he puts Hyrcanus on the throne. He makes him high priest as well, and gives him the title ethnarch. Now that's important because ethnarch, arch is a Greek word for ruler. Ethnos is, you probably know that, is a Greek word for people, right? So he's the ruler of a people. So he's not actually given the title king. So you can see that the Hasmoneans are sort of demoted a little bit. Because when Rome comes onto the scene, Rome's like, we're going to be calling the shots here. There's only one king in Rome. What's his name? Yeah, Caesar. Well, not quite Caesar, but in about 3 years it's Julius Caesar, right? But there's only one king. He's the emperor. He also divides Israel into 5 districts, and that's where these names, Judea, Samaria, Perea, Galilee, Idumea, that we read about in the New Testament, that's where these names or these geographical designations actually are formulated. Okay, so they're formed about 60 years or so before Jesus comes, or Jesus is born in the land of Israel. And Aristobulus is taken off to Rome. So Aristobulus taken out of the scene, and this weak leader is now the high priest and ethnarch. Not quite king, but the ruler. What happens after that? So after that, Pompey eventually leaves, and I won't get too much into the sort of the Roman history, but he leaves, and he actually gets into a sort of a fight with this guy Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar wins. Pompey flees to Egypt, eventually is killed, and now Julius Caesar is the ruler of Rome. And what he does is he elevates Antipater as procurator of Judea. Now, I know I've thrown around a lot of names so far, but the name to remember is Antipater because he is Herod the Great's father. Okay, so because Antipater had backed this guy, Hercules, and he's actually the hand inside of the puppet, Julius Caesar says, well, we want somebody that's going to support our causes. Let's get a guy that knows how to lead. This is the man. So Antipater is made the procurator of Judea, so he's sort of the governor, just under the ethnarch. Okay, so he's just under Hercules, but he's really the brains behind the operation. And what Antipater does is he gets his guys to rule the sub-regions of Israel. Okay, remember I mentioned some of those sub-regions? Galilee is one of them. Idumea is one of them. Well, 2 of them that are important. One of them is Galilee. Herod, his son, becomes the military leader in Galilee. And his other son, Phasael, becomes the governor of Jerusalem, basically the area of Judea and Samaria. Okay, so this is where Herod makes his career. He makes his career as being the head of the Jewish forces in Galilee under Antipater, who is the sort of second in command in Israel in 60 BC, just to put a round number. Okay? He's going to become king of Israel in 37 BC, 40, but he's going to actually effectively become king in 37, so about 30 years later. Okay, so he's going to really make his career as quite a successful leader of the Jewish forces in Galilee. Questions or comments so far? I know I threw out a lot of names, but you guys tracking with me? Yeah, Adam.
Can we go back to the slide for the 5 districts?
That one? Judea, Samaria, Perea, Galilee, Idumea. All right. Now, okay. It gets confusing. I'm trying to make it simple, but another thing that happens at this time is another cat wants to try and get some of a piece of the mouse. Try and use that metaphor there. Okay, so another cat comes onto the scene, and these guys are known as the Parthians. Now, just think of them as mildly equivalent to the Medes and the Persians. Okay, so they're off to the east. So you got Rome in the west coming in to try and control the land of Israel. And now the Parthians from the east, where the Medes are, they're trying to get a little piece of the pie. And so they invade the land, and they actually are successful in gaining the upper hand and sort of diminishing the influence of Rome for a short period of time. And when that happens, this guy Antigonus, okay, who's Aristobulus' son, remember that guy was taken off to Rome? This guy now becomes sort of the de facto governor because of the Parthians who come in and they say, no, we're calling the shots. This is our guy. Now, why would they do that? Why would they make a new person in charge of the Jews? Well, because the other guy is supporting their rival, Rome, right? So they want to put their guy on the throne. And so this invasion by the Parthians actually causes Herod the Great to flee. Herod the Great flees. Hyrcanus is actually sort of pushed out. Remember, he's a weak leader. So I should have mentioned Antipater, his father, is killed as well. Herod the Great's father is killed. Herod the Great jumps onto a ship and sails off to Rome. And so Antigonus is left as the de facto ruler, but this guy is still hanging on, Hyrcanus. And so what he does is he pulls a Mike Tyson fighting Evander Holyfield in, I forget when it was. Anybody remember that fight where Mike Tyson bit off the ear of Evander Holyfield? Is that how you say his name? When was it? Late night. I think it was something like that. So he actually bites off bites off Hyrcanus's ear. What's going on here? Now this is a tactical move on his part, though, because according to Leviticus chapter 21, well, let me back up for a second. Remember, Hyrcanus was given the title ethnarch, and he was made high priest. So this guy, Antigonus, wants both of those titles. He's already got the king. Well, he doesn't want him to be high priest either, so he bites off his ear and thus makes him ineligible for becoming the high priest, because according to Leviticus chapter 21, if you have some sort of an infirmity, namely a missing ear, or you can read the passage. I won't give any more examples. Some of them are a bit graphic. But if you are maimed in some way, you can't be the high priest. And so he actually succeeds in sort of pushing this guy off of the stage of world history by biting off his ear. Kind of an interesting move. And so that's the situation that we are left in at the end of the Hasmonean period. This guy, Antigonus, is the king. He's supported by the Parthians who have pushed Herod the Great out. Herod the Great has fled to Rome, and now we're at the end of the Hasmonean period, just before Herod the Great is going to come onto the scene. And I'm going to talk about Herod the Great in just a second. But let me just give you a couple summarizing points here. A couple features of all of these Hasmonean rulers. They combined the political and the priestly rules, right? Which is not anything that we saw previously in Israel's history, so very major change in the history of Israel. They also adopted Hellenism to a certain extent. Now, that's a general point. Some of them were more favorable toward Hellenism than others. Others were less. But one example that you can see this is look at their names. Probably surprised to see an Israelite king called Alexander, right? Alexander Ginnaeus. Or Hyrcanus. That doesn't sound, you can even hear that it just doesn't sound Hebrew. So they adopt some form of Hellenism, and they sort of tip their hat to Greece when it gives them the upper hand, when it allows them to be the ruler. And throughout the Hasmonean period, you see that there is a problem of succession. Okay, who is going to be the next king? And that's a problem that really doesn't really ever resolve itself, because none of them, from the very beginning, right, from the time of Mattathias on, none of them are descendants of David. None of them are from the tribe of Judah, and that's key. So that is a key point of contention among many Jews of the time. We think, not everybody, but some factions would say we think that only a person from the tribe of Judah should become the king. And that's going to contribute to Herod the Great's fear of somebody taking power from him, because he also is not from the tribe of Judah. Okay, let's take a 2-minute break, or a 3-minute break, and I'll just kind of start talking when we're ready to go. But if you can, maybe in 3 minutes, and we'll jump back up. We'll start back up with Herod the Great. Herod. Now, interestingly, Herod is not mentioned all that often in the New Testament. He's only mentioned actually one time in Matthew chapter 2. But let me just give you a little bit of detail about this guy. He's a very fascinating figure, very important because he had direct interaction with Jesus, or didn't quite see him, but he wanted to see him so he could worship him, right? So he's a fascinating figure. Josephus, if you don't remember who Josephus is, remember he's that historian that wrote from Rome in about 100 AD, wrote a history of the Jews. He talks a lot about Herod the Great. And I like this little phrase here. Herod is king of the Jews and friend of the Romans. And that summarizes his political stance perfectly. If there's one thing that Herod the Great is he's the friend of the Romans, but he's also king of the Jews. And Rome never doubted his commitment or his loyalty to their empire, right, to their cause. So let me just talk about him for a minute here. It's going to be more than a minute, a little while. So first of all, his family. It's very important to recognize where he comes from. Here's a family tree that I made. I don't know if you can see those little names. Pretty clear, actually. His father, we already mentioned, he's a guy called Antipater, okay, who was, remember, the supporter of that guy, Hercules, and military guy, political leader, wealthy, kind of aristocrat. Now, he is an Idumean, okay? So remember, those were those Edomites that were forced into Judaism. They were forcibly converted to Judaism. And his mother is a woman called Kypros, who is a Nabatean. Now, the Nabateans were basically desert dwellers, kind of like the Arabs of today or the Bedouin today in Jordan of today or in Saudi Arabia. They're basically kind of the predecessors to the Arabs. Okay, so he's half Idumean and half Nabatean. Now, what that means is he doesn't actually have any Jewish blood running through his veins, but he's Jewish through his father because his father was forcibly converted to Judaism, and he really was. I mean, if you would have asked him, what's your religion, Herod? He would have said, Jewish. In fact, Augustus, that was his emperor name, he frequently joked, he said, it's better to be Herod's pig than Herod's friend. And why is that? Because as a Jew, the pig's not going to die, right? But he doesn't eat pork. But if he's his friend, or I think he says his son, either one doesn't matter, because Herod killed a lot of people. And so he had no qualms killing his friends or his sons. And we'll see, he's a ruthless leader, a ruthless ruler, but quite an effective ruler, really, when you all things combined, all things considered. So in that sense, Herod is sort of semi-Jewish, right? He's got a connection, and he definitely says that he's Jewish, but he doesn't actually have any Jewish blood running through his veins. Now, he rules from 37 BC through 4 BC, so that's 33 years. Remember, the longest previous reign was John Hyrcanus, who ruled for 31 years. So this guy's got a long rule, and he's not from the tribe of Judah, right? He's not from any tribe. He's just sort of got a connection to Judaism through his father, as I said. Excuse me. Oh, I gave you this slide just so you can remember where Idumea is. Now, Josephus, let me read you again another passage. He takes every chance that he can, doesn't do it that often, but he takes every chance that he can to remind his readers that Herod is not rightfully a Jew and not rightfully a ruler. And he says this, he says, when Antigonus answered Herod's proclamation, well, let me just read it. But Antigonus, in answer to Herod's proclamation, told Silo and the Roman army that it would be contrary to their own notion of right if they gave the kingship to Herod, who was a commoner and an Idumean, that is, a half-Jew, when they ought to confer it to those who were of the royal family, as was their custom. Okay, so this is that guy Antigonus that had kicked out Hercules. I know all these names sound the same probably, right? But that's what he says about Herod the Great. He says, this guy is a commoner. He's a half-Jew. He's going to be the ruler. Shouldn't it be the royal family? Now, kind of interesting that Antigonus says that because he's not from the royal family either, but I'm not sure that he followed his logic all the way through. Okay, so that's what Josephus writes about Herod, and he reminds his readers through the voice of this guy, Antigonus, that he's a commoner, he's not from a royal family, and he's only a half-Jew, right? He doesn't have Jewish blood running through his veins. And so how does Herod actually get to become king? Well, you remember, we had those two cats that were fighting for the land. You have Rome and you have the Parthians, right? The Parthians get the upper hand. Herod sails off to Rome. He walks into the Roman Senate at that time, and there's two sort of rulers at that time, Mark Antony. What year are we in? Yeah, Mark Antony and Octavian. And he convinces the Roman Senate to give him the kingdom of Judea. And the reason they agree to make him the king is because he's opposed to the Parthians, and he's the son of the guy that they previously had put on the throne, Antipater. So it makes perfect political sense in their viewpoint to make Herod the king of Judea. So it's the Senate that actually makes him king of Israel, right? The Roman Senate. Now, again, another interesting point to remember, because it's not the Jews. The Jews didn't have any say in it. It's the Romans who were, controlling the area there. So he sails back to Israel, in the land of Israel, with this new title. And it effectively, that happens in 40 BC. It effectively takes him 3 years to actually sort of become the de facto king, or the actual king. So that's why we say his rule actually starts in 37, but he was appointed king in 40 BC. And once, I won't get into the details here, but once Herod becomes the king, he kicks this guy Antigonus away, and Josephus summarizes by saying that the Hasmonean line came to an end after 126 years. Theirs was a splendid and renowned house because of both their lineage and their priestly office, as well as the thing which its founders achieved on behalf of the nation, namely independence, right? Pretty amazing thing. They're able to push off the Greek yoke. But they lost their royal power through internal strife, remember, which we talked about, and it passed on to Herod, the son of Antipater, and here Josephus is reminding us, who came from a house of common people and from a private family that was subject to the kings. Okay, so he comes from a private family, Antipater, who's subject to the kings, Hercules, and more distantly, Rome. Okay, so Josephus doesn't like this guy. And really, we shouldn't like him either because he's a bad guy. By the way, he's called Herod the Great today, but in no historical source is he called Herod the Great. He's just called Herod. That's just a modern attachment that we've attached onto his name. No historical sources call him Herod the Great. Probably we call him the Great because he's a great builder, which we're going to see here in a second. He's an amazing builder. And it just so happens that everything he built coincided with the time of Jesus. So it's like the period in time where we have the most preserved buildings and amazing architecture is from Jesus' time. So it's pretty amazing fact of history there. So in his early years, he sort of spends time consolidating power. I wish I could go into more detail with this, but it's actually Octavian, the Roman general, who gives him even more land. These areas right here are actually added to his kingdom later on, even after, about 10 years after the Roman Senate makes him king. There's a very fascinating story about that. I'm going to skip it now, though. And what Herod does is he ends up building 3 temples that are devoted to emperor worship. Okay, one at a city called Samaria, which you know of, right? That was the ancient capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. Caesarea is another one, and a city called Panias or Banyas, as it's known. So he's a Jewish guy. You ask him, what religion are you? He's going to say Jew. He's Jewish. And yet he also builds 3 temples that are devoted to emperor worship. And he gives them the name, sort of Augusta, right? The Augustus Temple. So I'll talk about that in a second. So after he successfully consolidates his power, is effectively the king, he embarks on a massive building campaign. And I got a bunch of pictures to show you just because it's fun to see some of the things. And if you ever go to Israel, like, you can just still see all of this today. It's pretty amazing. Here's some of these major projects that he builds. One of them is at a site called Alexandrian Sartaba. This is where he actually buried 2 of his sons and his wife, all 3 of whom he killed. But this is right here in the center of the country there. Here's a picture. Actually, this one doesn't have too much to say for it. But on the top here, there's still some ruins from his little fortress that he built there. And it looks down into the Judean wilderness, and that's the Rift Valley. Very prominent place, beautiful view. That's Alexandria Sartaba. And then he builds this massive fortress of Masada, which you probably have heard before. Okay, Masada is where the last Jewish stronghold was, just 3 years after the temple was destroyed by Titus in 70 AD. Okay, so 40 years after Jesus' ascension, what's called the Jewish Revolt comes to an end with the fall of this massive fortress called Masada. Herod started to build this fortress down there near the Dead Sea, and there it is right there. What's amazing about it is it's totally disconnected from that's the Dead Sea. Okay, it's disconnected from these hills of the Judean wilderness on all 4 sides. Okay, so it's totally, in that sense, impenetrable. If you're up at the top there, it's nearly impossible to get up there and take this fortress. He built it as a palace because Herod loved to live luxuriously, especially in places that are inhospitable. Okay, he loved to live life to the fullest in like the most remote and desolate places. And so what he built on the top here, he built a palace. There's a palace there. He had swimming pools up there. One of them is 390,000 gallons. So there's no water up there, right? How do you get water up there? You actually bucket it up this snake path up here, and you just dump it in. He had cisterns. He would import wine from Italy, fish sauce from Spain, apples from Naples. Like, he had the most luxurious life right in the middle of the wilderness. Very desolate place. Amazing fortress today to visit. Okay, they started excavating the site back in the 70s, and today when you visit, it's really a cool place. The Romans, just as a side note, okay, about 75 years after Herod died, the Romans built the siege ramp. That's the Roman siege ramp, and eventually punched through the wall and took the city, and that was the end of the Jewish Revolt. So that's where it ended. Here's a picture from down below. It's a hike up there. I mean, it is hard to take that place. He also built a palace in Jericho. This is down here near the Dead Sea, just to the northern shore of the Dead Sea. And here is the ancient site of Jericho. Here's where he built his palaces up here. And it actually spanned this river here called the Wadi Kilt. Pretty cool palace that has it's built on a river, right, with the river running through it. Some of those remains are you can see today. He built a palace in Samaria, which he renamed Sebasti, which is a Greek form of Augustus, which means exalted one, right? So he's naming it after his patron, Caesar Augustus. Here's just some pictures of some Roman columns. There's a forum there, and the importance of this site is here Herod is sort of asserting himself as the new king of Israel. This was the ancient capital of Ahab, the ancient capital of, these other northern kings of the north. Omri, you might know him. yeah, some of these other things you probably don't know. But so by building a fortress here, Herod is saying, hey, I'm sort of this renewed biblical figure. I'm the head of the kingdom. So this is his temple of Augustus that is devoted to emperor worship. There's an Israelite pool here. Remember, Ahab was his chariot was washed off in the pool there near Samaria. He builds another fortress called Herodium, or Herodian, and this is where he's actually buried. And he built this also in the desert. Notice all these are in the desert. Jericho, not all of them, but these ones are Jericho, Masada, Herodian. And that's this fortress here. He basically kind of made this mountain. There's like somewhat of a mountain, and then he just threw a bunch of dirt up there and then built a massive fortress on the top. Here's kind of an artist's reconstruction with all of these hallways, one above the other, with 4 different wings, and you had like a garden in the middle and water flowing. This is where he actually was buried, and archaeologists have found some really amazing things. This is the main entrance. You go up this long staircase into this this fortress here of Herodian. There's a little theater that you could sort of watch, a little play or some games of some sort. That's in the desert. They also recently found these images. This is from inside the theater right there. There's the stands, right? There's the stage. But in here, this was buried over shortly after it was built, by the way. So that's why it was preserved for 2,000 years. So today, this is the original paint, right? You can see like these Nile River scenes that were painted to really make this like these are like box office seats for Herod's theater at Herodian. That's where he's buried. He built a city of Caesarea. You can hear the name Caesar in that, on the coast there. That's where he built the largest harbor in the Middle East, or in the Mediterranean, I should say. And he built it in a spot that is this is all sand. So he had to like engineer a way to make a harbor. This is the modern harbor, but his harbor went way bigger. And he used like cement that would harden underwater. He had all these really impressive engineering, I'm not an engineer, you can tell, but these engineering designs that really went into this harbor, because it's literally built on sand. And he had to bring water from 7 miles away, so he built an aqueduct across the sand that you can still see there to bring the water to the city. And a theater, this is a theater that's also mentioned in Acts chapter 12. His grandson actually dies in this theater. That's Herod Agrippa. If you want to look at that sometime. So he's just an amazing builder, right? I mean, that's the point, is to just impress you. He built another temple here at Banias, and I'll just go through these pictures quickly. Antipatris is named after his father, Antipater, and this is here sort of near the coast, and these walls actually are built by 1,500 years later, but some of his remains are from his city are down below that. And then he builds Jerusalem, right? All of that, we haven't even talked about Jerusalem. What does he do in Jerusalem? He refurbishes the temple, but not just the temple. He builds a massive fortress on the northern part of the Temple Mount called the Antonia Fortress. Names it after this guy, Mark Antony, who also was a Roman, a friend of his at one point. And then he builds these towers along the wall. Amazing builder, right? He's got tombs in Jerusalem. He also built a theater in Jerusalem. Now that's interesting because a theater is a pagan institution. So, right, they're talking about topics that are not going to be favorable to the Jews. Sometimes there's nudity involved, there's profanity, there's violence. So you can see that Herod is more liberal, right? He's a king of the Jews, but he's also a friend of the Romans. And so this is just a model, a sort of a model that is to scale of what Jerusalem looked like in Herod's day. Really cool. And this is his palace in Jerusalem. It had 2 wings that the architecture was based off of the architecture in Italy, in Rome, right? Those slanted roofs, that's something that you find only in Rome. And then he refurbished the temple, built this sort of temple area, refurbished the temple structure. Now again, let me just emphasize, this is still the second temple. Okay, Herod doesn't rebuild a destroyed temple, he just refurbishes it and makes it way cooler. Why such a big building program? Why does Herod go through all of this trouble to do all of this? Probably there's different motivations. One of them is for personal comfort, right? He likes to live in luxury in areas that are inhospitable. Imperial piety. So remember I mentioned those 3 temples that Herod builds that are devoted to emperor worship. He's a Jewish guy, but he's a liberal Jewish guy. So he also needs to tip his hat to Rome, to Caesar Augustus, and so he builds monuments that are going to please the Romans as well. Hence these 3 temples that he builds. Also Jewish piety. I mean, it takes a lot of work to refurbish that temple. He expands the Temple Mount so that it could hold upwards of 200,000 people. Now, on a typical day, throughout the year, there was about 80,000 people that lived in Jerusalem in Jesus' day, scholars estimate. During Passover, and the 3 major festivals, that number would swell to 150, sometimes 200,000 people. So imagine 200,000 people that have to offer a lamb as a sacrifice in one place. You have a bit of a logistic problem. You need a large area. So that's what he did. He made the Temple Mount huge, so you can fit a ton of people up there. Today, the Muslims have the mosque up there on the Temple Mount. They can easily fit 50,000 worshipers just in that area near the mosque. So you could fit 100,000 people. I mean, 100,000 is a big number. 80,000, 50,000 people on the Temple Mount during Passover. So he answers a logistical problem that the Jews genuinely had by building by really refurbishing the temple there. And then also to magnify his reputation. I mean, we're still talking about him today in Boise in 2021. So it's like pretty amazing what he did. So that's Herod the Great in a nutshell. As he begins to die, there's some strife in his family, and he ends up killing several of his sons just before he dies because he's afraid that they're going to take his throne. He kills his wife just before he dies. Actually, quite a while earlier. And just literally a number of days before he dies, he realizes that he is one of the most hated figures among the Jews. And so what he does is he tells his officers to imprison the Jewish aristocracy. Okay, so these are all the really important and wealthy people of the nation. Put them in prison, and when he dies, because he was extremely sick as he was dying, he was on his deathbed and just so sick. So they knew he's going to die. So he said, when I die, don't tell anybody yet that I die. Kill these 300 men that you've imprisoned so that there'll be mourning on the day that I die. Right? Once they realize all 300 of these wealthy citizens have been killed, people will be mourning, and then spread the word, oh, by the way, Herod the Great died too. So that people will be mourning on the day of his death. Now, his sister ended up saving these people, and they ended up not being killed the day that he died. But he died in excruciating pain. Some people think he had gangrene. And eventually was buried there at Herodian, and the archaeologists were looking for his tomb for 25 years. And they finally found it in, I think, 2010, I want to say, or 11. And so they had like this monumental runway where they brought his body, and then they brought it up the steps, and that was where his tomb was placed. This was just recently discovered, and tragically, the archaeologist that spent 20-some years looking for his tomb died just a number of months after he discovered his tomb in an accident there. So they just recently discovered his burial place. So in summary, Rome never questioned his loyalty to them. The Jews did, though. The Jews didn't like him. He was awarded the kingdom in 40 BC by Rome, but he effectively became king in 37 and then died in 4 BC. He married a Hasmonean, and now I didn't mention this, but I don't know if you noticed on that chart that I gave you. His wife, Mariame, was the sister of these Hasmonean kings, okay, of these Hasmoneans. So he's related to them through marriage. He himself is not a Hasmonean. He himself is an Idumean. So he doesn't win on either side. If he was a Hasmonean, then maybe some people would like him because he would be somewhat of a successor to the king, to the throne. But even those guys were not from the tribe of Judah. But then on through his actual ancestry, he's an Idumean and a Nabatean, so not even actually physically Jewish. Great builder, but greatly disliked. And then let me probably finish with this, I guess. Let's look at just briefly Jesus and Herod. In Matthew, Herod is mentioned. Okay, so I'm going to read here a couple verses from Matthew chapter 2. And this story is familiar to us, but hopefully this will put a little bit of context here. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. So interesting, right? There's some wise men from outside of Israel that come and say, hey, where's the guy that's born King of the Jews? Herod wasn't born King of the Jews. He wasn't even legitimately King of the Jews. He's made King of the Jews by the Romans. And so you get these guys coming from outside, from the east somewhere, that are saying, hey, we saw this mysterious star, and we want to come worship this guy who's born King of the Jews. How does he respond? Verse 3, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And you can understand why. All of a sudden, there's this guy who's born King of the Jews. Not even the Hasmoneans are born King of the Jews. They're not from the tribe of Judah. And so Herod tries to do what he knows best, do away with him, right? And he says, oh yeah, go bring him over here. Or ask, first of all, where he's supposed to be born. And they say, in Bethlehem, like the prophets say. And then he says, oh yeah, go search diligently for him. This is verse 8. And when you have found him, bring me word so that I too may come and worship him. Wink, wink. So I think that helps to put a little bit of context into why Herod acted in the way that he did. Now, does it justify his actions? Obviously not. But those kind of words are fighting words, right? There's somebody who's born King of the Jews. He was very well aware of the fact that he's not the legitimate king, and a lot of people didn't like him. And then how does he respond? He responds with this slaughter of babies, Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. And this was fulfilled, or then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. So he responds by ordering the slaughter of all the babies in Bethlehem. Now, Josephus gives us a lot of information about Herod. Okay, so there's like chapter after chapter, and it's a treasure trove for what life was like in Jesus' day. I mean, he talks about what the temple was like, the measurements, and he gives a ton of information. He doesn't mention this, though. Okay, Josephus doesn't mention Herod's slaughter of the babies in Bethlehem. And some people are troubled by that. And they're like, see, the Bible's not historically reliable. It talks about something that in extra biblical sources doesn't mention. Somebody made this up. How would I respond to that? I would say every single history that is written is limited, right? You can't ever write an entire history. How many books have been written on World War II? I mean, thousands. The reason is because no one book actually covers everything. And so every historian has to pick and choose what to record. And the fact that it's not recorded, let's say in Josephus or in Roman writings, doesn't mean that the Bible's record of this is untrue. It just means that they didn't record it for some reason or another. And if you think about Herod's reign, though, this story matches very much what we know about Herod. Herod was very quick to the draw. Let me give you just a couple examples. Early on in his reign, he executes Antigonus and Hyrcanus along with all of their supporters, Josephus tells us. He also kills the rest of the Hasmonean family. Okay, once he becomes the king, he wants to do away with all the ones that might be a competitor to his throne. He also does away with his brother-in-law, his mother-in-law, and his wife, Mariamne. In the final years of his reign, he kills his 3 oldest sons, Alexander, Aristobulus, and Antipater. When he himself faced an assassination attempt, he killed the 10 conspirators along with all of their families. And he also, as I mentioned, planned to kill all of the Jewish aristocracy right before his death. And let me just read you a portion from Josephus. Here's how Josephus summarizes Herod's reign. He says, when accusers were called, they first went through Herod's crimes, declaring that it was not to a king that they had submitted, but to the most savage tyrant that had ever lived. Vast numbers had been executed by him, and the survivors had suffered so horribly that they envied the dead. He had tortured not only individual subjects, but whole cities. He had pillaged his own to adorn those of other races, and he had shed Jewish blood to gratify foreigners. Depriving them of their old prosperity and their ancestral laws, he had reduced his people to poverty and utter lawlessness. In fact, the Jews had endured more calamities at Herod's hands in a few years than their ancestors had endured in all the time since they left Babylon in the reign of Xerxes and returned home. Now, Josephus makes a little bit of a blunder. Xerxes wasn't the Babylonian king, but we'll forgive him for that. Right? So he says Herod was the most cruel tyrant. So I think this story of Herod's slaughter of the babies in Bethlehem fits perfectly well with what we know about him. Namely, that he was a tyrant and that he was not afraid to do away with people that were threats to his kingdom. And as I said, just because it's not mentioned in other texts doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Now, one thing I will note, though, is the city of Bethlehem is or the village of Bethlehem, I should say, pretty small town in Jesus' day. Estimates vary from 400 to 800, maybe 1,000, let's say. So let's take the higher number. In a village of 1,000 people, how many babies 2 years old and under would there be there? Scholars estimate that we're probably talking about 20 in that neighborhood. So we're not talking about 10,000 or 4,000. You would expect if he slaughtered 10,000 people, that probably would have been mentioned in Josephus. 20 people, it's sizable for sure, but it's not so big that if Josephus didn't mention it, then it certainly didn't happen, right? So I think that helps to put a little bit more context on that story there. And then one final note. Josephus also tells us that just before Herod died, there was a lunar eclipse that occurred. And based on astronomical calculations, we can actually pinpoint the day of when there was that lunar eclipse, because you can work back lunar eclipses. So that lunar eclipse that was visible a few days before Herod the Great died is dated to March 12th or 13th, 4 BC. Okay, so it's March 12th or 13th, you're off by a day, 4 BC. So Herod the Great probably died within a number of weeks, or maybe maximum a month or two after that. So what that does for our chronology is it gives us an absolute date, right? Herod, or Jesus, was born before Herod the Great died. So back to the chronology question. Jesus had to have been born before 4 BC because Herod the Great was still alive on March 12th of 4 BC. The question is how long before that was Jesus born, or was Jesus born? Well, we don't have that much information. We do know of a number of things that occurred sort of between the time that Herod hears about Jesus' birth, or sort of between the time that Jesus was born and the time that Herod tries to kill him. Remember, after he's born, he's presented in the temple 40 days later. So evidently Herod hadn't heard about him yet. So go back at least 40 days from that time. You have the visit of the wise men. You have Jesus fleeing down into Egypt, and then you have the murder of the children in Bethlehem. So those are kind of the events surrounding Jesus' birth. And so I think kind of based on that, we could probably estimate that Jesus was born around the winter months of 5 BC. That's what seems to make the most sense to me. And maybe next week I'll go into more detail about why. I mean, why not 7 BC? Or why not 10 BC, right? He just has to be born before Herod dies. Well, because there's a number of other chronological factors that have to align in order for the complete chronology of Jesus to work out. So, with that, I think I'll end tonight. Any questions or comments? Yeah. Very good question. Yeah, so how does Herod build all of this stuff? So there's actually some discussion, like everything. Some think that Herod just taxed his way out of it, right? And so he just taxed the people. But this is to the scale that is, you can't tax people enough in order to build all this. So a large part of his revenue came from some farms that he had. Well, there's 2 sources of revenue. One are farms that he had down in Jericho. Now, Jericho is down in the Rift Valley, so it's a subtropical climate. So they grew dates down in that area, still do today. But these dates actually became famous. They exported these dates all across the Mediterranean. And so, you have references to Jericho dates like in Rome. So he was able to finance some of his projects by some of his farms, but also Herod owned the territory to the east, or didn't own it, but it was under his control. So the area of Jordan today and Saudi Arabia. And why is that important? Because there was a people group called the Nabateans that came right through his kingdom and passed through his kingdom in order to go over to Europe. Without a map, it's hard to explain. But these Nabateans, what they did is they went down along the western coast of Saudi Arabia, all the way down to the tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Sometimes they would cross over into Africa, and they would bring back spices and exotic herbs and animals and all this amazing plunder. They would bring it up through the desert, and in order to export it to Europe, to Rome and Greece, they had to come right through Herod's kingdom. So he actually taxed the foreigners as they came into his kingdom. Then they went to a city called Jaffa in Gaza, loaded all the stuff onto ships, and then sailed it off to Rome. So that was another major source of revenue for these building projects. Really good question. All right, let's finish there. Let me pray for us, then we can go. Father, thank you for this time. And Lord, as we think about how all of this history comes together, we're amazed at how you sovereignly stand in the background and how you fulfill prophecy even through a wicked king. Like Matthew says, out of Egypt I called my son, and you wanted Jesus to be this sort of Israel that is perfect, that comes out of Egypt and is able to save us. And Lord, we're just amazed at how you providentially work through history, sometimes in more direct ways and sometimes in the background. But all of that is a part of the story that is part of our history, because we, as Christians who believe in you, are part of this history as well. And so we're thankful for that. Thank you that nothing takes you by surprise, that even a census in Jesus' day is what you used in order to fulfill prophecy to get Jesus from from Nazareth down to Bethlehem. And so we're just amazed at that. I pray that you would help us as we go this week to remember that while things might seem confusing to us here, there is somebody, namely you, that is behind all things and providentially working out your plan to make everything perfect. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.